why does a monopolist face a downward sloping demand curve? It looks like the other tutor put a lot of thought into his answer choice, but um, we can draw out what the monopolist curve actually looks like, if that makes it a little bit easier to understand. So we have our price, we have our quantity, we have demand, supply. What makes this a monopolist curve is it also has a separate marginal revenue curve, which is separate from the demand curve. The if we assume supply is equal to marginal cost, then the intersection of marginal cost and marginal revenue tells us the profit maximization point. But instead of pricing at where we intersect here, you go up to the demand curve. This is going to be your final price. And so that's what the demand curve happens, and you have deadweight loss right here. That's the monopolist curve, and it asks us, why does the monopolist face a downward sloping demand curve? And so I'm not sure why the explanation needs to be so long, because the reason the monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve is because of the law of demand. All products have a downward sloping demand curve, with a few exceptions if you have like one of the extremes. But the law of demand tells us that as price goes up for a good, then the quantity demanded goes down, and if the price goes down for the quantity for a good, then the quantity demand is going to go up. And that relationship is constant regardless of if the market is a monopolist or if the market is in perfect competition or an oligopoly or in monopolist competition. Monopolistically competitive markets, right? That's what it is. Regardless of the form that the market takes and the number of buyers and sellers, that demand curve is always going to be downward sloping because it is a relationship from the consumer side of how consumers interpret prices, and not a relationship with the form of suppliers or the revenue curves of suppliers. And so that downward facing demand curve is simply a function of the law of demand that we would see in any similar market. Let's take a look at the answer that the tutor gave, just to kind of see what they're talking about here. So the tutor says, a monopoly is an industry in which there's only one seller. Because it's the only seller, the monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve, the industry demand curve. The downward sloping demand curve means that if the monopolist wants to sell more, he must lower his price. We are assuming that price discrimination is not possible and the firm can charge only one price. So because the monopolist must lower prices to sell more, the extra or marginal revenue it gets from selling another unit is less than the price it charges. Its marginal revenue curve is therefore below its demand curve. In contrast, for a seller who is a price taker, demand is identical with marginal revenue. Yeah, so that's a good explanation for why we see two separate curves, marginal revenue and demand, with marginal revenue being less. And that's because when the monopolist lowers its prices, it lowers not just it increases the quantity it sells, but also lowers the amount of money it makes per unit. And so it has to account for that by having a downward sloping marginal revenue curve that is below the demand curve. Oh, I see. So they gave a table as an example. So they said, table below shows the case of a monopoly. MC is the value of the additional resources needed to produce another output of a unit. The marginal benefit for consumers is the price that consumers are willing to pay. This column should be recognized as the demand curve. Maximization principle tells us that the economically efficient quantity to produce is 5, which gives consumer the highest value, and that's because 5 and 5 are equal to each other here. Marginal cost is equal to marginal benefit to consumer. To produce the first unit, company uses resources valued at $5 and turns it into something valued at 7. Because the transformation has increased value, producing the first unit is economically more efficient than producing none. According to this logic, producing the 6th unit would decrease economic efficiency because the company would take resources worth $5 and transform them into something with value of only $4.50. So that's correct. It's not. So you would never go to the 6th value for sure. And this assumes perfect competition. The monopolist, however, will find it more profitable to produce only 3 units because it does not see marginal benefit the same way that buyers see it for the seller. The additional benefit of the second unit is only 6. It sells the additional unit for $6.51, but to sell the second unit, it has to reduce the price of charges by 50 cents. Thus, it lost 50 cents on the first unit, so net increase in its revenue was only 601. And so that is correct. This is, again, the idea that the only way a monopolist can sell more is by reducing its price. And by reducing price, you lose not just money on the current unit, but money on all past units that you were selling. That difference is noted by the difference between these two columns. And so using the maximization principle, only the third unit is produced because that's where marginal benefit to the monopolist is equal to the marginal cost of the monopolist. And so anything else after that is actually going to cost the firm more to produce than it brings in value. And so you would see that that's why you would have an intersection of marginal revenue, and this is the quantity supplied and not what we would see in perfect competition, which would be this quantity over here. And so this is the final figure of a monopolist's quantity of production. And so that's what we keep an eye on. I think it was a very long-winded explanation, but very, very thorough. So very thorough explanation in terms of the original question, the reason that monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve is the same as the reason you would see a downward sloping demand curve in any other type of market law of demand. The law of demand, which tells us that as price decreases, the quantity demanded increases. So that's going to be our final, addendum to this question, and otherwise the solution is correct.